323 BC, Ecbatana, Persia. The most powerful man alive is standing outside a tent. He's not wearing armor. He's not holding a sword. He's not giving orders. He's just standing there. And he's making a sound that no one on his army has ever heard from him before. A sound that none of them, not the generals, not the veterans who have followed him across 100 battles, know how to respond to, because the man who conquered the known world is crying. Not quietly, not privately, in front of everyone. And the army has never seen him break his watching in silence, not knowing what to do with what they're seeing. This is not a story about conquest. This is a story about what conquest costs. About what it does to a man when the one thing that it cannot afford to lose is gone. And about how the night Alexander the Great wept in front of his entire army may be the most important night of his life, and the night that began the end of everything he had built. But to understand why, we have to go back further than Ecbatana, back to a childhood in Macedonia, to a boy who was told from the moment he could understand words that he was descended from Achilles on one side and Heracles on the other. That greatness was not something he had to earn. It was something he had to live up to. And standing beside a boy from the very beginning was another boy, one who would stay beside him until one of them was dead. His name was Sebastian. They met as children. By the time Alexander was being tutored by Aristotle at Mieza, Sebastian was there too. They read the same texts, trained together, argued together, and when Aristotle gave his students the Iliad, that ancient story of war and glory and the bond between warriors, Alexander chose Achilles as model. And Sebastian understood without being told that his role in that story was Patroclus. Achilles and Patroclus, the greatest warrior of the age and the one person he loved without condition, the one whose presence made the war survivable, the one whose absence would break him. This was not a small thing. This was the story Alexander used to understand his own life. His Sebastian was not just a friend fitted into that story. He was the reason the story made sense. When Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BC, the first thing he did when he reached Troy was visit the tomb of Achilles. He placed a wreath on it. He ran naked around it, as was the tradition of honoring the heroic dead. And Sebastian placed a wreath on the tomb of Patroclus, the young men at the graves of their mythological counterparts, performing a ritual that meant something to both of them that words could not quite reach. And then the war began. And it was extraordinary. In 11 years, Alexander led his army from Macedonia through Greece, through Egypt, through the entire Persian Empire, through Central Asia, into edges of India. He never lost a battle, not one. His tactics were studied for centuries after his death. His speed was legendary. His courage was not performed. He fought from the front. Always. He was wounded repeatedly, severely. He nearly died at least 3 times, and through all of it, Sebastian was there, not as a shadow, as a force in his own right. Sebastian commanded troops, negotiated with kings, organized logistics for an army of hundreds of thousands moving through some of the most inhospitable terrain of Earth. Tall, physically imposing, intelligent, diplomatically skilled in ways Alexander was not always able to be, where Alexander could be impulsive, volcanic, absolute. Hephaestion was measured, where Alexander sometimes burned the bridge before it finished crossing. Hephaestion helped build the next one. There's a story from Susa. Toward the end of the campaign, Alexander had arranged mass marriages between the officers and Persian noblewomen as part of his vision for a unified empire. Alexander himself married Stateria, the daughter of Darius, and he arranged for Hephaestion to marry Triphetes, Stateria's sister, so that their children would be cousins, so that the bond between them would be written into next generation, so that even in bloodline, they would be connected. Think about that. The most powerful man in the world, at the height of his power, using the architecture of his empire to make sure that he and his closest companion would be family, not just friends, not just colleagues. Family by deliberate design. The ancient sources debate the exact nature of their relationship in terms that were not the same categories they are now. What is not debated is the depth. Plutarch writes that Alexander said Hephaestion was a lover of Alexander, while others were merely lovers of the king. The distinction matters. One was attached to the men, the others were attached to the power. Hephaestion alone saw both and chose the man. This is what made him irreplaceable. Not his military ability, not his administrative skill, the fact that he was the only person in Alexander's world who knew the man beneath the king and loved that man specifically. Everyone else was in relationship with the conqueror. Hephaestion was in relationship with the boy who wanted to be Achilles and was terrified of what that meant. In 324 BC, the army arrived in Ecbatana. The campaign was effectively over. India was behind them. The army had forced Alexander to turn back at the Ephesus River, the one and only time his soldiers refused to follow. The wounds of that refusal were still fresh, but they were in Ecbatana now, in the heart of old Persia Empire. And there were games and festivals and the particular exhausted relief of men who have survived something immense. And Hephaestion fell ill. The source said it was typhoid fever. He was sick. He seemed to be recovering. His physician, a man named Glaucus, told him the worst was over, told him specifically that he was out of danger, and so Hephaestion, being Hephaestion, celebrated. He ate a large meal, he drank. He was 32 years old, and he had survived battles and deserts and mountains and 1,000 things that would have killed an ordinary man. He was recovering. And then he was not. Within hours, he was dead. What happened next is the part of Alexander's story that most histories mention briefly and move past. But I want you to stay here for a moment, because what happened next tells you everything about Alexander that his battles do not. When Hephaestion died, Alexander's first response was not grief. It was denial. He lay on the body for the entire day and into the night. Would not leave. Would not allow anyone to remove him. The generals stood outside and waited. The army stood outside and waited, and Alexander stayed with the body of his closest companion and did not move. This lasted until the following day. When they finally separated him from the body, he ordered the manes of all the horses cut, the ancient sign of mourning. He ordered the battlements of the city walls torn down. He ordered the music to stop throughout the camp. All music, silence, where there had been celebration. And then he wept. openly, publicly, in front of the army that had followed him for 11 years, that had seen him ride into spare points without flinching, that had watched him pull arrows from his own flesh and laugh. That army watched him collapse. There's something specific about the kind of grief Alexander showed. The ancient sources describe it as excessive, even by the standards of that time, excessive even for a king mourning a great general. Alien writes that he flung himself on the body. Arian, one of the more measured sources, described 3 days during which Alexander did not eat, did not drink, and could not be consoled. Plutarch says the grief was so violent and so prolonged that his companions were frightened, not of what he might do to others, but of what he might do to himself. It did not work. Nothing worked. The army marched on. There were still campaigns, a winter campaign against the Cassians that some ancient sources describe as a kind of violence as mourning. Alexander killing in order to feel something that moved in the same direction as grief. There was a planning for new expeditions, Arabia, the Western Mediterranean, the world behind what anyone had yet reached. Alexander, in his final months, was making plans of astonishing ambition, as if the only way to survive the loss was to expand the project so enormously that nothing could fit inside it, including the grief. But something had changed. The ancient sources are consistent on this point in a way that is remarkable, given how inconsistent they are on almost everything else. After Vespasian's death, Alexander drank more heavily. He became more erratic. The intervals of clarity were still there. His mind was still extraordinary, his plans still visionary, but the infrastructure of the man had been damaged in a way that showed. He arrived in Babylon in the spring of 323 BC. There were omens, the sorcerers say. Priests warned him not to enter the city. He entered anyway. He began planning a naval expedition around Arabia. He attended a banquet. He drank heavily. He fell ill the next morning. He never recovered. What exactly killed Alexander the Great is still debated. Typhoid, complicated by other factors, is the most widely accepted theory. Some have argued for poisoning. The political environment around him by the end of his life was dense with people who had reasons want him gone. One recent theory suggests he may not have actually dead when they buried him, that his lack of bodily decay for 6 days after apparent death may indicate Guillain-Barré syndrome, which can produce a state resembling death while the person remains alive. He was 32 years old, the same age Vespasian had been. He died without designating an heir. When his generals gathered around his deathbed and asked to whom he left his empire, he reportedly said, "To the strongest, or perhaps to the best." The sources give different words. What they agree on is that he did not name a successor, and within a generation, the empire he had spent his entire life building was divided, fought over, and transformed into several smaller kingdoms. None of them what he had imagined. There's a theory that some historians entertain but few state outright, because it is not the kind of thing that fits neatly into academic language. The theory is this: Alexander died of grief, not immediately, not directly, but the death of Bastion removed something from him that was structural, not just emotional, structural. The way a building can appear intact after something is removed from its foundation and then one day, without apparent cause, come down. He had been wounded more times than any man should survive. He had pushed his body through terrain and climate into preparation that would have broken most people a dozen times over. He had sustained for 11 years a pace of activity and decision-making and pressure that was extraordinary by any measure. And he had done all of this with a bastion beside him, not because a bastion made him stronger in some abstractual, motivational sense, but because a bastion was the one to whom he could be weak. The one space in his life where the performance stopped, where Alexander could be the boy from Macedonia who was terrified of not living up to the myth and be met with something that other than expectation. When that space closed, he had nowhere to put what he was carrying. He was carrying a great deal. The night he wept in Ecbatana was not a weakness. That is the thing most people misunderstand when they encounter this story. His grief was not a crack in his armor. It was the armor finally removed. For one night in front of an army that had watched him be superhuman for 11 years, Alexander was not a king or a conqueror or a son of Zeus. He was a man who had lost the person he loved most in the world. He did not hide it. He did not manage it. He did not convert it immediately into action. He let the army see it. And this is a part of the story that the histories and conquests tend to move past quickly because it does not fit the narrative of Alexander the Great, the unstoppable, the divine, the architect of the ancient world's most spectacular empire. But it is the most human part of this story, and perhaps, if you look at it carefully, the most important. Because here's what it tells you. The thing that held Alexander together through the battles, through the wounds, through the years of forward movement, through an increasingly alien word, was not ambition. Ambition was the engine. But the thing that made the engine bearable was this one relationship. This one person who had known him before the myth and kept knowing the man inside it. Remove that, and the engine keeps running for a while on its own momentum, but it has nowhere to go, nothing to run toward. Just movement, just forward until it cannot go forward anymore. He died 8 months later of fasting in a room in Babylon, with his general gathered around him, his empire undivided and his heir unnamed, surrounded by people who wanted things from him and he could no longer give. The ancient world built this legend immediately and thoroughly. Cities were named for him. His image appeared on coins across the Mediterranean for centuries. Militaries, commanders studies his tactics. Conquerors from Julius Caesar to Napoleon stood at his tomb or his portrait and felt something between reverence and competition. His name became a word for a particular kind of greatness, vast, rapid, total. But the night in Ecbatana is still there, underneath all of it, the most powerful man in the world standing outside a tent, making a sound his army had never heard him before. Not the sound of a king, not the sound of a conqueror, the sound of a man. This is the part of the story that marble statues do not show you, the part that the battle maps leave out, the part that whatever happens between the victories in the private architecture of a life where everything that is most real about a person lives, Alexander the Great conquered the known world. He did it faster and more completely than anyone before or since. He changed the course of history in ways that are still visible today. In the spread of Greek culture and language, in the cities he built, in the trade routes he opened, in the political ideas he set in motion. And it could not survive the death of one person. Not because he was weak, because he was human. And because the one thing that no campaign, no victory, no divine lineage can protect you from is the loss of that person who made you real to yourself. He wept in front of his entire army, and the army which had followed him to the edge of the world stood in silence and let him. This is a story history almost forgot to tell you. Not the conquest, not the battles, not the night, not the grief. This man, if this story stayed with you, there are others here that story tried to bury even deeper. Open one. The darkness goes further than you think. Subscribe to the channel. See you on the next one.